couldn't believe I was actually doing this. Standing outside the courthouse in Seattle, 34 years old, with my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the folder of documents that would either save my life or destroy what was left of it. The summer heat was suffocating, but that's not why I felt like I couldn't breathe. I was about to walk into a courtroom and face my own father, the man who taught me everything about business, everything about loyalty, everything about family, and then betrayed every single one of those lessons the moment my mother's body was cold in the ground. This wasn't just about money or control of the textile company Mom had built from nothing. This was about justice, about reclaiming the legacy that had been stolen, about refusing to let the man who was supposed to protect me become the one who destroyed everything I loved. What happened next would expose secrets so shocking, reveal corruption so deep, and unleash a truth so devastating that it would send multiple people to prison and prove that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who share your last name. The truth was coming out whether anyone was ready for it or not, and I had just whispered 2 words that would make a corrupt judge's carefully constructed world collapse. 3 years earlier, right after my mother died, everything started falling apart. My father, Richard, didn't waste a single day after Mom's funeral. Within weeks, he'd taken control of everything, every decision, every contract, every dollar. She'd left behind a textile company she'd grown from nothing, a legacy split 50-50 between me and him. But betrayal has a way of twisting even the clearest intentions, and what should have been shared became a battlefield I never wanted to enter. He brought in his girlfriend, a woman named Cassandra who was barely older than me, and gave her a senior position she had no qualifications for. I couldn't believe how fast he moved, how little he mourned, how easily he erased Mom's voice from the company she'd poured her soul into. When I tried to speak up in meetings, he'd talk over me, dismiss my ideas, treat me like I was some intern who didn't belong. The humiliation was constant, the disrespect was suffocating, and every day I watched the company my mother loved slowly fall apart under his reckless leadership. Contracts we'd held for years started disappearing. Longtime clients stopped returning calls. Money seemed to evaporate from accounts faster than I could track, and when I asked questions, Richard would smile that cold smile and tell me not to worry my pretty little head about things I didn't understand. The truth was, I understood more than he thought. I'd worked alongside my mother for 8 years, learning every corner of that business, every relationship, every number. I knew when something was wrong, and everything about this felt wrong. The company wasn't just struggling. It was being drained, systematically, deliberately, like someone was bleeding it dry from the inside. Then came the day I found the loan documents. I was going through files in the office late one night, trying to understand where $500,000 had gone, when I discovered paperwork for a business loan I'd never heard of. My signature was on every page, perfect and official, except I'd never signed anything. The shock hit me like ice water. My own father had forged my name, used my credit, my reputation, my share of the company as collateral for money that had vanished into projects that benefited only him and Cassandra. This wasn't just bad business. This was fraud, plain and simple, and it was my face on the crime. I confronted him the next morning in his office, my hands trembling with rage and disbelief. I laid the documents on his desk and demanded an explanation. Richard barely looked up from his computer. He laughed, actually laughed, like I'd told him a joke instead of accusing him of a felony. "You think you could run this company?" he said, leaning back in his chair with that smug expression I'd grown to hate. "You're just a girl playing dress-up in Mommy's old office. You don't have what it takes." The words cut deeper than any betrayal, deeper than any lie, because they came from the man who was supposed to protect me, supposed to believe in me. That's when I knew. There was no fixing this with conversations or compromise. Richard had chosen his path, and it led straight through everything my mother built, everything I loved, everything I'd sworn to protect. So I called a lawyer, a sharp-minded attorney named Marcus who specialized in corporate fraud and family litigation. We spent weeks building the case, gathering evidence, preparing for war. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't have predicted, was that the courtroom I was walking into wasn't neutral ground. It was already rigged, already bought. And the man in the black robe sitting behind the bench was about to show me just how deep my father's corruption really went. The first sign that something was off came during the preliminary hearing. The judge assigned to our case was a man named Vincent Hargrove, a veteran of the Seattle court system with a reputation for being firm but fair. Except the moment he walked into that courtroom, I saw my father's face light up with recognition, saw them exchange a look that made my stomach drop. Marcus leaned over and whispered that he'd do some digging, but we both felt it. That sinking feeling when you realize the game is already fixed before the first move is made. Justice was supposed to be blind, but apparently it had eyes for old friends and backroom deals. Marcus immediately filed a motion for the judge to recuse himself, citing conflict of interest. We had proof they'd gone to law school together, had been photographed at charity events, had connections that made impartiality impossible. But Judge Hargrove denied the motion without hesitation, his voice dripping with condescension as he claimed he could remain perfectly objective despite his relationship with Richard. I sat there watching this man who was supposed to represent the law, who was supposed to protect the truth. And all I could think was how my mother would have felt seeing this. She believed in doing things the right way, believed that hard work and integrity mattered. The betrayal wasn't just coming from my father anymore, it was coming from the system itself. From that moment on, every hearing felt like watching a performance where the ending was already written. When Marcus presented evidence, Judge Hargrove would barely glance at it before moving on. When Richard's lawyer spoke, the judge leaned forward with interest, nodding along like every word was gospel. Our witnesses were cut off mid-sentence, told they were wasting the court's time with details. Richard's witnesses were given endless room to ramble, to speculate, to paint me as an emotional daughter who couldn't handle her grief. The scales of justice weren't just tipped, they were shattered on the floor, and no one seemed to care. Richard played his part perfectly. He'd transformed into this wounded father figure, speaking in that smooth, silver-tongued way that had always made people trust him. He told the court how he'd tried to protect me from the burden of running the company, how I'd become unstable after my mother's death, how he'd only taken control to preserve her legacy from my reckless decisions. I couldn't believe how easily the lies rolled off his tongue, how he could sit there and rewrite history with such confidence. Every word was calculated, every emotion performed, and Judge Hargrove ate it up like it was the truth instead of the most elaborate fiction I'd ever heard. We brought in a forensic document examiner, a respected expert who'd testified in dozens of cases. She explained in clear, technical detail how my signature on those loan documents had been forged. The pressure points were wrong, the letter formations didn't match, the timing of the ink didn't align with when I was supposedly in the building. It was textbook fraud, undeniable evidence that should have changed everything. But Judge Hargrove barely looked at her report, asked 2 dismissive questions, and then thanked her for her time like she'd just given a weather forecast. The humiliation of watching real evidence get ignored, of seeing truth treated like background noise, made me want to scream. I left the courthouse that day feeling like I was drowning. Marcus tried to reassure me, said we'd appeal, said we'd find another way. But I could see the worry in his eyes, too. My father had bought himself a judge, had stacked the deck so thoroughly that even with proof, even with witnesses, even with the law on my side, I was losing. Cassandra was waiting for Richard outside, and I watched them laugh together as they walked to his car, probably celebrating another day of getting away with it. That's when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize, and everything changed. The message was short, anonymous, almost cryptic. "Your father isn't just a fraud. I have proof. Meet me tomorrow, 3 p.m., the coffee shop on Pine Street. Come alone." My first instinct was to delete it, to assume it was some scam or cruel prank. But something about the timing, the specificity, the way it arrived right when I needed it most, It felt like the universe was finally throwing me a lifeline. I couldn't believe I was actually considering meeting a stranger based on a random text. But desperation has a way of making you brave, or maybe just reckless. I showed Marcus the message and he warned me to be careful, but we both knew I was going either way. The next afternoon, I walked into that coffee shop with my heart pounding and my guard up. I scanned the room looking for someone suspicious, someone dangerous, someone who screamed, "Trap." Instead, I found a woman in her early 60s sitting alone in the corner, dressed in a conservative business suit, her gray hair pulled back neatly. She looked tired, worn down by something heavy, and when our eyes met, she nodded once. I sat down across from her, and she introduced herself as Margaret, former head accountant for Richard's division of the company, someone who'd worked under him for almost 15 years before suddenly retiring 8 months ago. "I should have come forward sooner," Margaret said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I was scared. Your father has connections, power, ways of making problems disappear." She slid an envelope across the table, thick with papers, and told me to look through it carefully. Inside were copies of financial records, email chains, transfer receipts, a trail of money flowing out of the company into shell corporations, offshore accounts, investments that existed only on paper. The shocking part wasn't just that Richard had been stealing. It was the scale of it, the years of systematic theft, the way he'd built an entire shadow empire using my mother's business as his personal bank. Margaret had documented everything, kept copies of everything, because she knew one day someone would need the truth. She told me about the pressure Richard had put on her to falsify reports, to hide transactions, to make the numbers look clean when they were rotting underneath. She'd refused at first, but he'd threatened her job, her pension, her reputation. Classic Richard, using fear and manipulation to get what he wanted. Eventually, she'd gone along with it, hating herself every day, until my mother died, and she realized she couldn't keep lying for a man who'd betrayed his own family. The guilt had been eating her alive for years, and when she'd heard I was taking him to court, she knew it was time to choose a side. "Your mother was a good woman," Margaret said, her eyes glistening. "She deserved better than what he did to her memory." The evidence she gave me was devastating. Email threads where Richard explicitly instructed people to forge documents, to backdate contracts, to create false invoices. Bank statements showing payments to Cassandra's personal accounts for consulting fees on projects that didn't exist. Payback was coming. I could feel it building in my chest like a storm about to break. But Margaret warned me that evidence alone might not be enough. Not with Judge Hargrove in Richard's pocket. "You need to understand something," she said, leaning forward with urgency. "Your father doesn't play fair. He buys loyalty, he destroys obstacles, and he's very good at covering his tracks." As we talked, Margaret mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She'd noticed suspicious transactions in the company books, payments made to a consulting firm that seemed to have no actual purpose, no deliverables, no reason to exist. The firm's name was listed as Hargrove Advisory Solutions, and it was registered under the name of someone named Daniel Hargrove. "I don't know if it means anything," Margaret said, "but the timing of those payments always seemed to line up with when your father needed legal issues to go away quietly." I felt my hands go numb as the implication hit me. She was suggesting what I'd already suspected, but hadn't wanted to believe. That the corruption went deeper than Richard. That it had infected the very system supposed to stop him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my laptop in my apartment, curtains drawn, the glow of the screen casting shadows across my face. I didn't do this in one night. I followed trails my mother taught me to see. She'd spent years showing me how to trace connections, how to read between the lines of corporate filings, how to spot patterns that didn't quite add up. I started researching Judge Vincent Hargrove, his background, his finances, his family, anything that might confirm what Margaret had implied. Public records are surprisingly revealing when you know where to look, and I'd spent enough time managing a business to understand how to trace connections. What I found made my stomach twist with a mix of rage and vindication. Vincent Hargrove had a son named Daniel, 32 years old, who ran a consulting company called Hargrove Advisory Solutions, the exact same firm that had received payments from my father's operations. I dug deeper, cross-referencing property records, business filings, corporate registrations. A year and a half ago, a commercial property in downtown Seattle had been sold to a limited liability company with a convoluted ownership structure. The LLC was technically owned by an offshore entity, but when I traced the paperwork back through multiple layers, I found Richard's fingerprints all over it. 2 months after that sale, the property was flipped to another buyer at a significant loss, except the buyer was a real estate investment group where Daniel Hargrove was listed as a principal consultant. The pieces were falling into place like a nightmare puzzle, each connection more damning than the last. Then I found the payments. Buried in the financial records Margaret had given me, I discovered a series of wire transfers to Hargrove Advisory Solutions. $75,000 here, $50,000 there, payments spread out over 2 years and disguised as legitimate business expenses. But there were no contracts, no invoices, no work product to justify the money. These weren't consulting fees. They were bribes wrapped in corporate language, payback for fixing problems and making inconvenient legal troubles disappear. The truth was right there in black and white, a paper trail connecting my father directly to the judge who was supposed to be impartially deciding our case. I took screenshots of everything, saved documents in multiple locations, created backups of backups. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the electric realization that I'd found the weapon I needed. This wasn't just evidence of fraud anymore. This was evidence of corruption at the highest level. Proof that the entire trial had been compromised from the start. Marcus had told me to be careful, had warned me that desperate people do dangerous things, but I'd gone past the point of playing it safe. My mother's legacy was on the line. My own future was hanging by a thread. And I'd just discovered that the system designed to protect me was actually the weapon being used against me. I spent hours that night constructing a timeline, matching up dates when Richard had legal issues with dates when payments went to Daniel's firm. The pattern was undeniable. When Richard had been investigated for labor violations 3 years ago, a payment of $80,000 went to Hargrove Advisory 2 weeks before the case was mysteriously dropped. When a former business partner sued him for breach of contract, $60,000 moved through the same channel, and the lawsuit settled for pennies on the dollar. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a long-term arrangement, a corrupt relationship built on mutual benefit and sealed with blood money. Vengeance doesn't always come through violence or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it comes through revealing the truth in a way that can't be ignored or explained away. The sun was starting to rise when I finally closed my laptop. I'd barely slept, but I felt more awake, more focused, more ready than I had in months. Tomorrow, we had another hearing scheduled, and I knew Judge Hargrove would continue his charade of impartiality while steering everything in Richard's favor. But this time, I wouldn't be walking in defenseless. This time, I had something Richard hadn't counted on, the kind of evidence that destroys reputations, ends careers, and sends people to prison. I thought about my mother, about how she'd always taught me that truth and integrity matter more than anything. She'd been right, but she'd never told me how hard it would be to fight for those things when the entire world seems designed to crush you for trying. The courtroom was packed the next morning, more crowded than usual, with the kind of tension that makes the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. I sat next to Marcus, my folder of evidence on the table between us, trying to keep my expression neutral even though my heart was racing. Judge Hargrove took his seat with his usual air of authority, and Richard sat across the aisle looking confident, comfortable, like a man who knew he'd already won. Cassandra was beside him, dressed impeccably, playing the role of supportive partner with practiced perfection. I couldn't believe how normal everything looked, how this room full of people had no idea they were about to witness something that would change everything. Marcus stood to present our next round of evidence, but before he could speak, I touched his arm and whispered that I needed to address the court directly. He looked at me with confusion and concern, but I'd already made up my mind. This wasn't just about legal strategy anymore. This was about calling out the corruption to its face, forcing the truth into the open where it couldn't hide behind procedure and technicalities. I stood up, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system, and asked the judge for permission to make a statement regarding new evidence that had come to light. Hargrove looked annoyed, probably assuming I was about to make some emotional plea, and waved his hand dismissively for me to proceed. "Your Honor," I began, projecting my voice so everyone in the courtroom could hear. "I've recently discovered information that raises serious concerns about the impartiality of this trial." The room went silent. Richard's lawyer started to object, but I kept talking, pulling out the documents I'd prepared. "I have evidence of financial transactions between my father's business operations and a consulting firm called Hargrove Advisory Solutions, which is owned and operated by Daniel Hargrove, your son." The judge's face went pale, then red. "Furthermore, I have property records showing suspicious real estate transactions involving both parties and a pattern of payments totaling more than $400,000 over the past 3 years, all occurring in proximity to legal matters involving my father." The courtroom exploded. Reporters started typing furiously. Spectators began whispering. Richard's lawyer was on his feet shouting about baseless accusations and scandalous defamation, but I just stood there calmly, holding the documents up where everyone could see them. Judge Hargrove was slamming his gavel, demanding order, but his authority had already evaporated the moment I'd connected the dots publicly. Marcus had grabbed the documents from me and was already moving toward the bench, handing copies to the clerk, making sure everything went into the official record before anyone could stop us. This was the moment, the shocking revelation that turned a rigged game back into a fair fight, or at least exposed the rigging so thoroughly that continuing was impossible. "These are serious allegations," Judge Hargrove finally managed to say, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "But they don't change the fact that this trial—" Marcus cut him off, his lawyer voice sharp and commanding. "Your Honor, with all due respect, these allegations absolutely change everything. We're moving for an immediate mistrial based on judicial misconduct and conflict of interest. The evidence my client has presented suggests a financial relationship between the defendant and this court that compromises the entire proceeding." The judge tried to argue, tried to claim the payments were legitimate consulting fees for unrelated matters, but every word he spoke just made him sound more guilty, more desperate. I watched my father's face as the reality crashed over him. The silver-tongued devil who'd charmed his way through every deposition, who'd manipulated every conversation, who'd backstabbed his own daughter without a moment's hesitation. He looked genuinely afraid for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Cassandra had gone white, shrinking back in her seat like she wanted to disappear. The truth has a way of doing that, of stripping away the masks and revealing what's really underneath. All the lies, all the fraud, all the betrayal. It was unraveling in real time, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. Judge Hargrove declared a mistrial, his voice shaking with rage as he made the announcement. He tried to maintain some dignity, claiming he was doing it in the interest of justice, to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. But everyone in that room knew what had really happened. He'd been caught, exposed, and humiliated in front of the entire legal community. As the courtroom cleared, Margaret sent me a text. "I heard what happened. There's more. Daniel's consulting firm is a shell company. I have records of 8 more payments, all routing back to offshore accounts. This isn't just one corrupt deal. It's a system." I looked down at my phone, then back at the empty judge's bench, and realized we'd only scratched the surface of how deep this really went. The scandal broke in the media within hours. By that evening, every local news station was running the story. Judge and business owner connected through secret payments. Corruption allegations rock Seattle court system. Daughter exposes father's bribery scheme. My phone wouldn't stop ringing with reporters requesting interviews, legal analysts wanting comments, strangers offering support or hurling accusations. The whole thing had exploded beyond the courtroom, transforming from a private family dispute into a public reckoning with corruption and betrayal. I stayed off social media, stayed away from the television, because I knew that watching myself become a headline would make it harder to focus on what still needed to be done. What followed didn't happen overnight. Investigations take time, but the fall was inevitable. The State Judicial Commission launched an immediate investigation into Judge Hargrove. Within a week, he'd resigned from the bench, claiming he wanted to spend more time with family and focus on other opportunities. The classic language of disgrace, trying to look like choice. But the investigation didn't stop with his resignation. Federal prosecutors got involved, digging into the financial connections between Richard, the judge, and Daniel's shell consulting firm. What they found was even worse than I'd imagined. A network of bribes and kickbacks spanning years, involving multiple cases, multiple payoffs, and a systematic perversion of justice that had affected dozens of people who'd thought they were getting fair trials. My father's world collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. The scandal destroyed his reputation overnight. Business partners backed away, contracts were terminated, clients demanded investigations into whether their own dealings had been legitimate. The company started hemorrhaging money as people distanced themselves from anyone connected to the corruption story. Cassandra, who'd been so confident and untouchable just days before, suddenly announced she was taking a leave of absence and disappeared from public view. It turns out loyalty purchased with money and status evaporates pretty quickly when those things vanish. The payback I'd wanted, the justice I'd fought for, it was happening, but not in the clean, satisfying way I'd imagined. It was messy and public and painful for everyone involved. I threw myself into trying to save the company, the business my mother had built and my father had nearly destroyed. I met with longtime employees who'd stayed loyal despite everything, who'd watched Richard's corruption with quiet disgust, and were relieved someone had finally stopped him. Together, we started rebuilding relationships with clients, renegotiating contracts that had been sabotaged, bringing in outside consultants to audit the finances and clean up the mess. It was exhausting work, the kind that required 18-hour days and impossible decisions. But it also felt like reclaiming something sacred that had been stolen. Every client we won back, every employee we reassured, every dollar we recovered. It was one more step toward restoring my mother's legacy. The legal battles weren't over, though. A new judge was assigned to our case, a woman named Judge Patricia Morrison, who had a reputation for being absolutely incorruptible and taking no nonsense from anyone. She'd reviewed all the evidence that had been ignored or dismissed in the previous trial, and she'd made it clear from day one that this proceeding would be conducted by the book with zero tolerance for manipulation. Marcus was cautiously optimistic, but I'd learned not to trust the system until it actually delivered. We prepared for the second trial with military precision, organizing documents, coordinating witnesses, building an argument so airtight that not even the most skilled defense attorney could tear it apart. Margaret agreed to testify, despite her fears about retribution. Other former employees came forward too, people who'd been silenced or intimidated by Richard, but who found courage in seeing the corruption exposed. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged signatures, the hidden loans, the shell companies, the systematic fraud that had drained millions from the business. But what made the strongest impact in that courtroom wasn't just the financial crimes. It was the emotional testimony about betrayal, about a man who'd taken his daughter's trust and her mother's memory, and used them both as tools for personal gain. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about truth being spoken out loud, where everyone can hear it and validate what you knew all along. The new trial moved forward with a precision and fairness that felt almost surreal after what we'd been through. Judge Morrison listened to every witness, examined every document, asked pointed questions that showed she actually understood what she was looking at. There were no dismissive gestures, no favoritism, no sense that the outcome had been predetermined. This was what justice was supposed to look like: impartial, thorough, focused on truth rather than connections or convenience. I watched Richard across the courtroom, saw how he'd shrunk somehow, how the confidence had drained away, leaving behind something small and defensive. The silver tongue that had served him so well wasn't working anymore because the judge wasn't interested in charm. She was interested in facts. Marcus presented our case methodically, building from the timeline of events after my mother's death through the systematic takeover Richard had orchestrated. We showed how he'd marginalized me in meetings, excluded me from decisions, and positioned Cassandra in roles she wasn't qualified for. Then came the financial evidence, the forged loan documents, the shell company transfers, the hidden accounts where company money had been funneled. Margaret testified for nearly 3 hours, walking the court through spreadsheets and email chains that documented years of fraud. She was nervous but clear, her voice steady as she explained how Richard had pressured her to falsify records and hide transactions. Her testimony was devastating, impossible to dismiss or spin, and I watched Richard's lawyer struggle to find any crack in her story. But the evidence that really sealed Richard's fate wasn't just about the money. It was about the relationship between him and Judge Hargrove. Federal prosecutors had joined the case by this point, presenting their findings about the bribery scheme that had corrupted multiple trials over the years. They showed the payments to Daniel's consulting firm, the property transfers, the coordination of legal strategies with the sitting judge's input. It wasn't just that Richard had committed fraud against the company. He'd participated in corrupting the judicial system itself, turning courts into weapons against anyone who challenged him. The shocking scope of it all left the courtroom in stunned silence. This wasn't one bad decision or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was calculated, long-term criminal behavior. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. Judge Morrison read it in a firm, clear voice that carried weight and finality. Richard was found liable for fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty. The court ordered him to return every dollar he'd taken, stripped him of any ownership in the company, and transferred complete control to me. But that wasn't all. The federal prosecutors announced they were filing criminal charges related to the bribery scheme, charges that carried serious prison time if convicted. My father sat frozen in his seat, his face gray, looking like someone who'd just watched their entire world collapse and couldn't quite process the magnitude of it. Karma had finally caught up to him, and it was more thorough than I'd ever imagined it could be. Judge Hargrove's fate unfolded in parallel. The Judicial Commission's investigation led to formal charges of corruption, accepting bribes, and obstruction of justice. His son Daniel was indicted too, facing charges related to operating a criminal enterprise disguised as a consulting business. The evidence showed that over 7 years, they'd received more than $400,000 from Richard alone, plus hundreds of thousands more from other clients who'd needed legal problems to disappear. The web of corruption touched multiple cases, affected dozens of families, and represented a complete betrayal of public trust. Both men were convicted. Both were sentenced to prison terms that would ensure they couldn't hurt anyone else for a long time. I stood in the courtroom after the sentencing hearing, watching Richard being led away in handcuffs, and felt something I didn't expect. Not satisfaction or triumph, but a profound sadness mixed with relief. This was my father, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and walked me through my mother's factory explaining how everything worked. But he'd also been willing to destroy everything she built, to steal from his own daughter, to corrupt the legal system itself just to maintain control and enrich himself. The truth was complicated and painful. You can love someone and still need to stop them, still need to hold them accountable, still need to say that what they did was wrong and cannot stand. Justice doesn't always feel good, but it's necessary anyway. The months after the trial were about rebuilding, not just the company, but my own sense of what family and loyalty really mean. I worked 16-hour days alongside the employees who'd stayed, the ones who'd believed in my mother's vision, and who'd waited patiently for someone to finally fight for it. We renegotiated contracts with suppliers who'd been scared off by the scandal. We reached out to clients who'd left during Richard's chaotic leadership, and slowly, painfully, we started winning them back. Every small victory felt enormous because it represented one more step away from the betrayal and one more step toward restoring what had been taken. The business wasn't just surviving, It was starting to thrive again, like a plant that had been nearly killed by neglect, finally getting water and sunlight. I made changes that honored my mother's memory and values. I promoted longtime employees who demonstrated real skill and integrity, people who'd been overlooked during Richard's regime because they weren't willing to play his games. I implemented transparent financial reporting systems so that what happened with Richard could never happen again. I started a scholarship fund in my mother's name, supporting young women who wanted to enter the textile industry, creating opportunities for the next generation the same way Mom had created opportunities for me. These weren't just business decisions. They were acts of reclamation, ways of saying that the company would return to being what it was always meant to be. A place built on hard work, creativity, and treating people with dignity. The media eventually moved on to other scandals, other stories. But the impact of what happened stayed with me every day. I heard from other people who'd been victimized by corrupt systems, who'd felt helpless against powerful people with connections and money, and who found some measure of hope in seeing that truth can still win sometimes. Their messages reminded me that this was never just about me or my family. It was about a larger principle, about refusing to accept injustice just because fighting it feels impossible. My mother used to say that doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing, and she was more right than she probably ever knew. Standing up to Richard, exposing the corruption, fighting through a rigged system, none of it was easy, but all of it was necessary. Richard ended up serving a 6-year sentence for his crimes. Judge Hargrove got 5 years, and his son Daniel got 3. The sentences felt both too long and not long enough. Too long, because part of me still remembered the father he'd been before greed and ego consumed him. Not long enough because of the damage he'd done to so many lives, including his own family. I didn't visit him in prison, didn't take his calls, didn't respond to his letters. Some people told me I should forgive, should try to reconcile, that he's still your father, no matter what he did. But forgiveness isn't about pretending the betrayal didn't happen. It's about releasing the anger without accepting the behavior, and I wasn't anywhere near that place yet. Maybe I'd get there someday, maybe I wouldn't. But either way, it would be on my terms, in my time. The company celebrated its 50th anniversary a year after the trial ended. We held an event honoring my mother, displaying photos of her throughout the decades, sharing stories from employees who'd worked alongside her. I gave a speech about her vision, her integrity, her refusal to compromise on quality or values, even when it would have been easier or more profitable. I didn't mention Richard. This night wasn't about him or what he'd done. It was about celebrating what Mom had built and what we'd fought to preserve. As I looked out at the crowd of employees, clients, industry partners, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride not just in survival, but in victory. In the knowledge that dignity and self-worth don't come from what others give you, but from what you refuse to let them take. Looking back at everything that happened, I realized the real lesson wasn't about revenge or even justice in the legal sense. It was about the choice between accepting comfortable lies or fighting for uncomfortable truths. Richard chose the lies. He told himself he deserved everything, that his actions were justified, that the rules didn't apply to someone as clever and important as him. I chose the truth, even when it meant losing my father, even when it meant public scandal and exhausting legal battles and months of sleepless nights wondering if I'd made the right call. The shocking part isn't that corruption exists. It's that so many people see it happening and choose silence because speaking up costs too much. But silence has a cost too. And sometimes it's higher than anyone realizes until everything worth protecting is already gone. So here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted, someone you loved, was capable of betrayal so complete that it changed how you see the world? Drop a comment below and tell me your story, because I know I'm not the only one who's had to make impossible choices between protecting a relationship and protecting the truth. What would you have done in my position? Would you have taken your own father to court, or would you have tried to find another way? And here's the real question that keeps me up at night. When the system itself is corrupt, when the judge is bought and the game is rigged from the start, how far are you willing to go to expose it? I want to hear about your experiences with family drama, with betrayal, with that moment when you realized someone you loved wasn't who you thought they were. Tell me about the times you've had to fight for what's right even when it cost you everything, or the times you stayed silent and wish you hadn't. Share your thoughts on justice versus revenge. Because let me tell you, there were plenty of moments when I wanted payback more than I wanted fairness, and figuring out the difference between those two things was harder than anyone ever tells you. Your stories matter, your perspectives matter, and I genuinely want to know. How do you rebuild after someone you trusted destroys everything you believed in? If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel or question something you've been carrying around, then do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because this channel isn't about surface-level drama or easy answers. It's about diving into the complicated, messy, painful truths about family, betrayal, justice, and what it really takes to reclaim your dignity when everything's been stripped away. I'm going to keep sharing stories that challenge you, that make you uncomfortable in the best way, that give you insights you won't find anywhere else about navigating the darkest parts of human relationships and coming out stronger on the other side. Don't just watch and disappear. Engage with this community we're building. Share your wisdom. Learn from each other's experiences. The next video might be about your situation, might answer the question you've been too afraid to ask, might give you the permission you need to finally do what you know is right, even when it's terrifying. Subscribe now so you don't miss it, and remember, the truth doesn't care about your timeline, your comfort level, or your family's reputation. The truth just is, and sometimes loving someone means refusing to lie for them anymore. Drop those comments, hit that notification bell, and let's keep this conversation going, because we're all just trying to figure out how to survive the people who were supposed to love us the most.